The amber glow of Edison's tavern cast long shadows across worn wooden tables, where the quiet hum of intellectual discourse mixed with the gentle clink of glass against glass. It was one of those rare Washington evenings where the humidity had finally broken, and the city's political elite had retreated to their air-conditioned offices, leaving the old Georgetown establishment to its usual clientele of professors, journalists, and the occasional philosopher who had wandered too far from academia. In the far corner, beneath a faded photograph of Benjamin Franklin, two men sat across from each other at a table scarred by decades of heated debates. The bartender, a grizzled veteran of countless political arguments, had learned long ago to keep the whiskey flowing when these particular patrons began their discussions. Tonight promised to be no different. Karl Marx adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and took a slow sip of his bourbon, his weathered face reflecting years of exile and revolutionary fervor. Across from him, Edmund Burke nursed a brandy, his more refined appearance speaking to a life spent in the corridors of power rather than the streets of rebellion. The two had been introduced by a mutual acquaintance at the Smithsonian earlier that evening, and what had begun as polite conversation had quickly evolved into something far more substantial. You know, Marx began, his German accent still thick despite decades of writing in English, I find it fascinating that we should meet here, in a country born of revolution, to discuss whether such upheavals are beneficial to humanity. Burke smiled wryly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Indeed, though I would argue that the American experience proves my point rather than yours. Their revolution succeeded precisely because it was measured, deliberate, and built upon existing traditions, rather than seeking to destroy them entirely. The tension between their worldviews was already palpable, like electricity in the air before a storm. Marx leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense with the passion that had driven him to spend his life analyzing the mechanics of social change. Burke maintained his composed demeanor, but there was steel beneath his gentleman's exterior, the steel of a man who had witnessed the terror in France and understood the price of radical transformation. Measured, Marx's voice carried a note of incredulity. Tell that to the loyalists who fled to Canada, or the Native Americans whose lands were seized. Revolution is never tidy, my friend. The question is whether the suffering it causes is justified by the liberation it achieves. Burke set down his glass with deliberate care. And that, I believe, is where we fundamentally disagree. You see revolution as liberation. I see it as the unleashing of forces that consume both the guilty and the innocent. The French Revolution began with noble ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, yet it devoured its own children and paved the way for Napoleon's tyranny. The bartender glanced over at their table, recognizing the signs of a debate that would last well into the night. He had heard enough political arguments to know when two ideologies were about to clash like tectonic plates, reshaping the landscape of discourse around them. Marx chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You speak of the terror as if it invalidates the entire revolutionary project, but what of the terror that came before? The systematic oppression of the poor, the casual brutality of aristocratic privilege, the grinding poverty that killed more surely than any guillotine. When peaceful change is impossible, violent change becomes inevitable. Inevitable, Burke repeated, tasting the word as if it were bitter medicine. There's the crux of our disagreement, Marx. You believe in historical inevitability, in the march of progress through conflict. I believe in the possibility of growth through preservation, of change through continuity. What you call inevitable oppression, I might call imperfect order, order that can be improved without being destroyed. The tavern around them seemed to fade into the background as their debate gained momentum. Other patrons turned their heads occasionally, drawn by the intensity of the discussion, but neither man paid them any attention. They were locked in a battle of ideas that had been raging for centuries and would continue long after they were gone. Marx ran his fingers through his graying beard, a gesture that had become habitual during his years in exile. Imperfect order, he mused. What a wonderfully euphemistic way to describe a system that condemns millions to lives of quiet desperation so that a few may live in luxury. You speak as if reform were simply a matter of adjusting the settings on some great machine, but the machine itself is designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of those who already possess both. Burke's composure never wavered, but his voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. And you speak as if destruction were a form of creation, as if tearing down centuries of accumulated wisdom and tradition could somehow produce a better world ex nihilo. Tell me, Marx, When your revolution comes, who decides what rises from the ashes? Who determines the shape of this new world order? The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from the bartender's pipe, acrid and impossible to ignore. It was the question that had haunted every revolutionary movement since the dawn of time, and Marx knew it as well as Burke did. But where Burke saw it as a fatal flaw in revolutionary thinking, Marx saw it as the very essence of human liberation, the right of the oppressed to determine their own destiny. The ice in Marx's glass had long since melted, diluting the whiskey to a pale amber that caught the tavern's dim light. He stared into it for a moment, as if reading the future in its depths, before looking up to meet Burke's steady gaze. "You ask who decides," Marx said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent among the working poor of London, Manchester, and Paris. "The answer is simple: those who have been excluded from every other decision that matters. The factory worker who has never owned anything but his labor, the tenant farmer ground down by rent and debt, the seamstress working 16 hours a day to put food on her children's table. These are the people who should decide, because they are the ones who truly understand the cost of the current system." Burke leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming silently against the table's surface. The gesture betrayed none of the agitation he felt at Marx's romantic vision of popular sovereignty. He had seen what happened when the mob was unleashed, had watched from across the channel as France tore itself apart in the name of popular will. "But that's precisely the problem," Burke replied, his voice measured but firm. "You're asking people who have never held power to suddenly wield it responsibly. You're expecting those who have been shaped by oppression to somehow transcend their circumstances and create justice. History shows us that power corrupts not just the privileged, but anyone who grasps it suddenly and without preparation." Marx's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Preparation? You mean like the preparation our current leaders received? Born into wealth, educated in the finest schools, raised from childhood to believe that their comfort depends on others' suffering? That kind of preparation?" The question struck home, and Burke felt it. He had spent his own life among the privileged classes, had seen their casual cruelty and breathtaking ignorance of the lives of common people, but he had also seen their capacity for wisdom, their understanding of the delicate balance that held society together. Education and experience matter, Marx, not because they make someone inherently superior, but because governing is a skill like any other. It requires knowledge, practice, and institutional memory. When you tear down existing structures overnight, you lose all of that accumulated wisdom. You're asking people to rebuild civilization from scratch, and that's a task that has never been accomplished without enormous suffering. Marx set down his glass with enough force to make the wooden table shudder. Around them, the tavern had grown quieter as the evening wore on, but their debate had only intensified. The bartender had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was now listening openly, drawn in despite himself by the passion of their arguments. "Accumulated wisdom," Marx repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Is that what you call the knowledge of how to extract maximum profit from human misery? The expertise in maintaining systems that ensure the rich grow richer while the poor grow poorer? Tell me, Burke, what wisdom is there in a system that produces abundance alongside starvation, that creates technological marvels while children work in coal mines?" Burke felt the force of the accusation, but refused to be drawn into Marx's emotional appeal. "You're conflating the abuse of a system with the system itself. Yes, there is suffering under the current order, terrible, inexcusable suffering, but there is also prosperity unknown to previous generations, scientific advancement, artistic achievement, and gradual improvement in the conditions of life for millions of people. Reform can address the abuses without destroying the foundations." "Gradual improvement," Marx scoffed. "How convenient for those who are not suffering to counsel patience to those who are. How easy to preach reform from the comfort of Parliament, while workers die of preventable diseases in overcrowded tenements. Your gradual improvement is fast enough to ease the conscience of the privileged, but slow enough to ensure that their privileges remain intact." The accusation hit Burke harder than he cared to admit. He had indeed lived a life of relative comfort, had never known the desperate hunger or backbreaking labor that Marx described so vividly in his writings, but he had also witnessed the aftermath of rapid change, had seen how quickly idealistic reforms could descend into chaos and terror. "And your revolution promises what exactly?" Burke countered, his composure finally showing signs of strain. "An end to suffering, a perfect society where all contradictions are resolved, You speak as if history will somehow stop once your revolution succeeds, as if human nature itself will be transformed by the mere act of overthrowing capitalism. Marx's eyes flashed with something between anger and pity. No, Burke. I promise only that working people will have the chance to shape their own destiny, instead of having it shaped for them by those who profit from their labor. I promise struggle, difficulty, mistakes. But I also promise that those mistakes will be made by the people themselves, not imposed upon them by their supposed betters. The silence that followed was heavy with unresolved tension. Both men realized they had reached the heart of their disagreement, not just about revolution, but about human nature itself, about the capacity of ordinary people for self-governance, about whether stability or justice should take precedence when the two came into conflict. Outside, Washington continued its nocturnal rhythm, unaware that in one small tavern, two of history's most influential thinkers were wrestling with questions that would determine the fate of nations yet unborn. Burke signaled the bartender for another round, using the brief interruption to compose his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less defensive, more philosophical, as if he were addressing not just Marx but the weight of history itself. "Let me ask you something, Marx," he said, as fresh drinks appeared before them. "In all your analysis of capitalism, in all your descriptions of revolution, where do you account for the simple human desire for continuity? Not just among the wealthy, among everyone. The peasant who wants to pass his small plot to his children, the craftsman who takes pride in traditions handed down through generations, the mother who wants her daughter to grow up in a world that makes sense to her." Marx studied Burke's face, recognizing that they had moved beyond mere political debate into something deeper. "You're talking about conservatism as a psychological need rather than an economic system," he said thoughtfully. "And I don't dismiss that need, Burke. But I would argue that capitalism itself destroys the very continuity you claim to defend." He leaned forward, his passion evident but now channeled into explanation rather than attack. "The peasant you describe, capitalism drives him from his land to work in factories. The craftsman, his skills become obsolete overnight when machines can do his work faster and cheaper. The mother, she watches her children grow up in conditions she never experienced, speaking languages of industry and alienation she cannot understand. Capitalism is the most revolutionary force in human history, constantly tearing up the roots of tradition in pursuit of profit." Burke absorbed this argument, feeling its force despite himself. Marx was right about capitalism's disruptive nature. Burke had witnessed it firsthand in England, had seen ancient villages emptied as their inhabitants flocked to the new industrial cities. But his response came from a different understanding of human nature. "Then we agree that change is inevitable," Burke said slowly. "But you see disruption and conclude that we should accelerate it, embrace it, use it as a tool to create something entirely new. I see the same disruption and conclude that we should try to manage it, to preserve what is valuable while adapting to what is necessary." "Manage it for whom?" Marx shot back. "When you say, we should manage change, who is this we you're referring to? Because in my experience, the people who get to manage change are the same people who benefit from keeping change minimal and controlled. The coal mine owner doesn't mind gradual reform as long as he gets to keep his mines. The factory owner is perfectly happy to improve working conditions as long as he doesn't have to share ownership with his workers." The bartender had given up all pretense of working and was now sitting on a stool behind the bar, chin in hand, listening as if his life depended on understanding their argument. Perhaps it did. Perhaps all their lives depended on which vision of change would ultimately prevail. Burke took a long sip of his brandy, letting its warmth spread through his chest before responding. "But when you say revolution, Marx, who is this collective revolutionary subject you keep invoking? You speak of the working class as if it were a single entity with unified interests, but surely you've observed the same thing I have, that people's loyalties are complex, that they often identify more strongly with their nation, their religion, their region than with their economic class." "True enough," Marx admitted, "but those other loyalties, useful as they may be for maintaining the status quo, become secondary when people's material conditions become unbearable. A French worker and a German worker may speak different languages and worship different gods, but they share the experience of selling their labor to survive. They share the experience of watching their children grow up in poverty while their employers live in luxury. And yet," Burke pressed, "when revolution comes, those other loyalties don't simply disappear. They reassert themselves, often violently. The French Revolution began with universal declarations of human rights and ended with French armies conquering Europe in the name of nationalism. The English Civil War began with Parliament defending the rights of the people and ended with Cromwell's military dictatorship. Marx felt the weight of these historical examples, but refused to be deterred by them. "You're committing the sin of every conservative thinker, Burke. You're using the failures of past attempts to justify accepting present injustices. Yes, previous revolutions have been incomplete, have been hijacked by new forms of oppression, but that doesn't mean revolution itself is impossible. It means we need to understand why those revolutions failed and learn from their mistakes." Burke's smile was sad rather than triumphant. "And what makes you think this time will be different? What makes you believe that human nature has somehow changed since Robespierre's time or Cromwell's?" "Power corrupts, Marx. It corrupts gradually, and it corrupts suddenly. It corrupts the bourgeoisie, and it corrupts the proletariat. The only protection is to limit power, to divide it, to surround it with institutions that can check its worst impulses. But those institutions," Marx replied with growing intensity, "are themselves corrupted by the economic system that creates them. Your parliament, your courts, your schools, they all serve the interests of capital in the end, no matter how noble their founding principles. You cannot reform a system from within when that system determines who gets to participate in reform." The debate had reached another impasse, but both men sensed that they were circling something important, some fundamental truth about human nature and political possibility that neither had yet been able to articulate fully. The tavern's grandfather clock chimed 11 times, its resonant tones briefly interrupting the intensity of their conversation. Marx glanced toward the window, where Georgetown's tree-lined streets lay empty, except for the occasional late-night walker. The civilized quiet of the scene stood in stark contrast to the revolutionary fervor of their discussion. "We've been dancing around something," Marx said, his voice lower now, more intimate. "The question that makes comfortable people uncomfortable. The question of violence. You fear revolution because you know it cannot succeed without breaking things, without forcing change on those who would prefer to maintain their privileges. But tell me, Burke, do you consider the current system peaceful?" Burke's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass. He had been expecting this line of argument. Marx was too sophisticated a thinker to ignore the violence inherent in the status quo. "I consider it more peaceful than the alternative you propose." "More peaceful for whom?" Marx leaned back in his chair, his tone becoming almost conversational. "For the child working 14 hours a day in a textile mill? For the family evicted from their home because they cannot pay rent? For the workers who die of preventable diseases because medical care is a commodity they cannot afford? You call this peace, but it's only peaceful for those wealthy enough to avoid experiencing its violence directly." Burke had heard this argument before, but tonight it felt more personal, more pointed. Perhaps it was the whiskey, or perhaps it was the genuine respect he had developed for Marx's intellect, despite their disagreements. Either way, he found himself engaging with the question more honestly than he might have in a public debate. "You're right," he said quietly. "The current system does involve violence, systemic, often invisible violence that slowly grinds people down rather than killing them quickly. But the violence of revolution is different in kind. It's sudden, unpredictable, and it tends to escalate beyond anyone's control. The violence of the status quo is terrible, but it's terrible in ways we understand and can sometimes mitigate. Revolutionary violence is terrible in ways that surprise us." Marx nodded slowly, acknowledging the honesty of Burke's response. "So your preference for reform is really a preference for familiar injustice over unfamiliar injustice. At least we know how the current system fails. We've learned to live with its contradictions." "That's unfairly reductive," Burke replied, but without heat. "My preference is for change that doesn't require us to burn down the world in order to rebuild it. Yes, there's something to be said for familiar problems. At least we've had time to develop institutions and traditions that can address them, however imperfectly. But those same institutions," Marx countered, "have had centuries to address systemic poverty and inequality, and they have consistently failed to do so. In fact, they've grown more sophisticated at managing and legitimizing injustice rather than eliminating it. Your parliament passes factory reform laws that sound progressive but leave the fundamental structure of exploitation intact." The bartender approached their table hesitantly, clearly torn between his desire to close for the evening and his fascination with their conversation. Burke noticed and waved him away with a gesture that promised a generous tip for his patience. "Let me grant your point about institutional failure," Burke said, "but consider the alternative. When revolutionary violence begins, Who controls it? Who decides which institutions deserve to be destroyed and which should be preserved? You speak eloquently about working-class consciousness, but in practice, revolutionary movements are led by intellectuals like us, by people who may understand suffering theoretically, but haven't necessarily experienced it firsthand. Marx felt the personal sting of this observation. It was true that he had spent more time in libraries than in factories, more time writing about revolution than participating in it. But he had also lived in poverty, had seen his children go hungry, had experienced firsthand the indifference of a system that valued property over people. "You're not wrong about revolutionary leadership," Marx admitted, but that criticism cuts both ways. The current system is also led by people who haven't experienced its worst effects, by aristocrats and capitalists who make decisions about workers' lives from the comfort of their estates and boardrooms. At least, revolutionary intellectuals are trying to understand and represent the interests of the oppressed rather than the interests of the oppressor. Burke smiled grimly. Trying to represent, yes, but representation is not the same as accountability. When a member of parliament makes a decision that hurts working people, he must face them in elections. When a revolutionary leader makes a decision that hurts working people, he can claim that they simply don't understand their own interests yet. Elections, Marx laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean the choice between candidates who all serve the same master, capital? The beautiful democracy where workers get to choose which representative of the ruling class will ignore their interests for the next few years? Your elections are a safety valve, Burke. They channel popular discontent into harmless rituals that change nothing fundamental about the structure of power. The intensity of their debate had drawn them both forward across the small table, their faces now illuminated by the single candle burning between them. Outside, Washington slept peacefully, unaware that in this small tavern, two men were grappling with questions that would shape the destiny of nations. Burke pulled back slightly, studying Marx's face in the flickering candlelight. The German philosopher's passion was undeniable, but Burke sensed something else beneath it, a kind of desperation, as if Marx understood that time was running out for his vision of revolutionary transformation. "You know," Burke said thoughtfully, "I think our real disagreement is about the nature of progress itself. You see history as a series of conflicts between opposing forces, with each victory leading to a higher stage of human development. I see it as a more gradual accumulation of wisdom, tradition, and institutional knowledge, progress through preservation rather than destruction." Marx straightened in his chair, recognizing that Burke had identified something fundamental. "Yes, but your conception of progress assumes that the current trajectory is essentially correct, that we're already moving in the right direction, just slowly. My conception assumes that the current trajectory is fundamentally wrong, that apparent progress under capitalism is actually a form of sophisticated barbarism." "Sophisticated barbarism," Burke repeated, tasting the phrase. "That's quite an indictment. But consider what capitalism has actually accomplished in the past century: the dramatic increase in life expectancy, the reduction of absolute poverty, the expansion of literacy and education, the technological innovations that have improved daily life for millions of people. Are you really prepared to dismiss all of that as barbarism?" Marx's response came quickly, as if he had been anticipating this argument. "I'm prepared to ask at what cost those improvements came and who paid that cost. Yes, some people live longer and better under capitalism than their ancestors did under feudalism, but they also work longer hours than medieval peasants, live in more crowded and polluted conditions, and have less control over their daily lives. And for every person whose life has improved, how many others have seen their traditional ways of life destroyed without receiving adequate compensation?" Burke leaned forward, his own passion beginning to show. "But that's precisely my point. Traditional ways of life were often brutal, limited, and oppressive in their own right. The medieval peasant you romanticize was bound to his land, subject to the arbitrary authority of his lord, and likely to die young of diseases we now consider trivial. At least capitalism offers the possibility of mobility, of improvement, of escape from the circumstances of one's birth. The possibility," Marx emphasized, "but only the possibility, and only for a few. Meanwhile, the vast majority experience capitalism as a new form of bondage, wage slavery instead of feudal slavery, but slavery nonetheless. And this new system is more insidious because it presents itself as freedom. The worker is told he is free to sell his labor to any employer he chooses, but if he doesn't sell it to someone, he starves. The tavern around them had grown completely quiet except for their voices and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. The bartender had long since given up any pretense of working and was now sitting openly at the bar, absorbed in their debate. Burke took a slow sip of his brandy, using the pause to formulate his thoughts. But surely you must acknowledge that this wage slavery is qualitatively different from actual slavery. The worker can quit, can move, can organize with other workers to demand better conditions. These may seem like small freedoms, but they're real freedoms that can be expanded through political action. Can he really quit? Marx asked rhetorically. Can he really move? These freedoms exist in theory but not in practice for most workers. A man with a family to feed cannot simply quit his job to look for better work. He must take what he can get. A woman working in a factory cannot simply move to where conditions are better. She lacks the resources to relocate. You speak of organization, but organizing workers is illegal in most places, and where it's legal, it's severely restricted. Burke felt the weight of Marx's practical objections, but remained unconvinced that revolution was the answer. Then let's work to make those freedoms real, rather than merely theoretical. Let's expand the right to organize, improve working conditions through legislation, create social safety nets that give workers genuine choices. These reforms may be gradual, but they're also sustainable. They don't require us to tear down everything and hope that what emerges from the chaos is better than what we destroyed. Marx's eyes flashed with frustration. But don't you see? The very people who would have to implement those reforms are the ones who benefit from the current system. Asking capitalists to reform capitalism is like asking slave owners to reform slavery. They may make cosmetic changes to ease their consciences or quiet unrest, but they will never voluntarily give up the fundamental source of their power. And yet, slavery was abolished, Burke pointed out quietly. Not through revolution in England, but through persistent political pressure, moral persuasion, and gradual reform. The process took decades, but it succeeded without the bloodshed that accompanied abolition in other countries. Marx was ready for this example. Slavery was abolished in England because it was no longer economically necessary, because industrial capitalism had found more efficient ways to exploit human labor. The English could afford to be moral about slavery because they had discovered wage labor, but they're not about to abolish wage labor because they haven't found anything more profitable to replace it with. The comparison hung in the air between them, sharp and uncomfortable. Both men knew they had reached another crucial point in their debate, the question of whether moral progress was possible within existing economic systems, or whether such systems inevitably corrupted every attempt at reform. The candle between them had burned down to a stub, its flame dancing precariously as wax pooled on the wooden table. Marx watched it flicker, seeing in its dying light a metaphor for something he couldn't quite articulate, perhaps the fragility of all human institutions, or perhaps the inevitability of change itself. "You know, Burke," he said softly, "there's something almost tragic about our conversation tonight. We're both dead men arguing about futures we'll never see. Whatever happens, revolution or reform, it will be judged by generations who will have to live with the consequences of choices we can only theorize about." Burke was struck by the sudden intimacy of Marx's observation. It was true. They were both aging men whose grand theories would outlive them, whose ideas would be tested in ways they could never fully anticipate. "Perhaps that's why this conversation matters," he replied. "Not because we'll solve anything tonight, but because we're trying to think beyond our own immediate interests, beyond our own lifespans." Marx nodded slowly. "It occurs to me that if you're right, if gradual reform can eventually address the fundamental injustices of capitalism, then my revolution would be not just unnecessary but harmful. I would be advocating violence and disruption to achieve goals that could be reached more peacefully." "And if you're right," Burke responded, "if the system is so fundamentally corrupt that it cannot be reformed from within, then my gradualism is not just ineffective, but immoral. I would be counseling patience to people who are suffering while blocking the only path to their liberation." The weight of this mutual recognition settled over them like a heavy blanket. Neither man was accustomed to acknowledging the possibility that his life's work might be wrong, but both were too honest to ignore the stakes of their disagreement. "The terrible thing," Marx continued, "is that we probably won't know who was right until it's too late to change course. If I'm wrong about revolution, we'll only discover it after the violence has begun and the old institutions have been destroyed. If you're wrong about reform, we'll only discover it after decades of incremental change have failed to prevent widespread suffering." Burke felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late hour or the tavern's drafty windows. History will judge us, but only after the people we're trying to help have paid the price for our mistakes. The worker dying of preventable disease can't wait for our theoretical disputes to be resolved. The child laboring in dangerous conditions needs help now, not in some hypothetical future where either revolution or reform has finally succeeded. Which brings us back to the question of violence, Marx said, his voice barely above a whisper. Is it more violent to maintain a system that kills people slowly and quietly, or to overthrow it quickly and loudly? Is it more moral to accept responsibility for the suffering we can see and measure, or to accept responsibility for the suffering we might cause but cannot predict? The bartender had dozed off at his post, his head pillowed on his arms. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the silence, marking the passage of time that seemed suddenly precious and limited. Both men were acutely aware that their conversation was drawing toward some kind of conclusion, though neither was sure what that conclusion might be. "I keep thinking about accountability," Burke said finally. "Under the current system, for all its flaws, there are mechanisms for holding power accountable. Elections, courts, public opinion, the press. They're imperfect mechanisms, often corrupted by wealth and influence, but they exist. In revolution, who holds the revolutionaries accountable? Who prevents them from becoming the very thing they sought to overthrow?" Marx had wrestled with this question for years, and his answer came slowly, as if he were still working it out. Perhaps accountability isn't something that can be guaranteed by institutions. Perhaps it can only come from the ongoing struggle of people to assert their own interests. The moment any group, reformers or revolutionaries, stops being challenged by those they claim to represent, they become corrupt. But that suggests a kind of permanent instability, Burke observed. A society in constant tension, always questioning its own foundations. How do you build anything lasting under those conditions? How do you accumulate knowledge, develop culture, create the kind of continuity that human beings seem to need? Marx smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a smile without irony or bitterness. Maybe we don't build anything lasting. Maybe the attempt to create permanent institutions is itself the problem. Maybe what we need is the capacity for constant renewal, constant questioning, constant struggle. Burke shook his head slowly. That sounds exhausting, and it sounds dangerous. How do you distinguish between healthy questioning and destructive nihilism? How do you know when to preserve and when to transform? "I don't know," Marx admitted, "but I know that the alternative, accepting injustice in the name of stability, is worse than not knowing." The dying candle finally guttered out, leaving them in the pale light from the street lamps filtering through the tavern's windows. The symbolic timing was not lost on either man. Their debate had literally burned itself out, leaving them in a different kind of illumination, cooler and less certain than the warm glow they had started with. Burke signaled for the check, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge that their conversation was reaching its natural end. The bartender stirred from his doze, blinking owlishly as he tried to remember where he was and what century he was living in. "You know what troubles me most about our entire discussion," Marx said as they waited for their bill. "It's the assumption that we have to choose between revolution and reform, between stability and justice, between gradual progress and dramatic transformation. Maybe the real problem is thinking in those binary terms at all." Burke raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting observation from someone who has spent his career analyzing the contradictions of capitalism in dialectical terms. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis." Marx laughed, and this time there was genuine humor in it. "Touché. But perhaps that's exactly my point. Maybe the synthesis isn't something that emerges from the conflict between revolution and reform, but something that transcends both categories entirely. Or maybe," Burke replied thoughtfully, "the synthesis is the ongoing tension between them. Maybe societies need both revolutionary energy and conservative wisdom, and the art is in finding the right balance for each particular moment and circumstance." The bartender approached with their check, moving carefully in the dim light. As Burke reached for his wallet, Marx placed a hand on his arm. "Wait," Marx said. "Before we settle up and go our separate ways, I want to acknowledge something. You've forced me to confront questions about my own position that I've been avoiding. The question of revolutionary leadership, the problem of accountability, the possibility that reform might achieve the same goals with less suffering. These aren't just theoretical challenges to be dismissed. They're real problems that any serious revolutionary movement has to address." Burke felt unexpectedly moved by this admission. "And you've forced me to confront the violence inherent in the status quo, the way that calls for patience, can become forms of complicity with injustice. I can't go back to defending gradual reform without acknowledging that for many people, gradual isn't fast enough to prevent real suffering. They sat in silence for a moment, each man grappling with the implications of what the other had said. The bartender waited patiently, sensing that something important was happening at his small corner table. "Perhaps," Burke said slowly, "the real question isn't whether revolution or reform is correct in some abstract sense, but which approach is most likely to reduce human suffering in specific circumstances. Sometimes reform might be possible and preferable. Sometimes revolution might be necessary despite its costs." Marx nodded. "And perhaps the choice between them shouldn't be made by intellectuals like us, sitting comfortably in taverns, but by the people who would bear the costs either way, the workers whose conditions we're debating, the families whose lives would be disrupted by either gradual change or sudden transformation." "But that brings us back to the question of expertise," Burke pointed out. "Can people make informed choices about complex political and economic questions without the kind of education and leisure that most working people lack? And if they can't, then who makes those choices for them?" Marx was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the empty street. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that had been absent from most of their debate. "I don't know," he said finally, "and maybe that's the most honest thing either of us has said tonight. We don't know. We have theories, we have arguments, we have passionate convictions about what justice requires and what human nature allows, but we don't know whether revolution or reform will actually produce the outcomes we hope for." Burke felt a strange sense of relief at this admission. "Then perhaps our responsibility isn't to provide definitive answers, but to keep asking the right questions, to keep the tension alive between the need for change and the need for stability, between the demands of justice and the requirements of order." Marx stood and extended his hand to Burke. "In that case, my friend, I hope we've done our job tonight." Burke took the offered hand, surprised by the firmness of Marx's grip and the genuine warmth in his eyes. "Indeed we have, though I suspect the questions we've raised will outlive us both." As they settled their bill and prepared to leave the tavern, both men knew that they would carry this conversation with them for whatever time remained to them. They had not solved the fundamental problems of human society, but they had perhaps done something more valuable. They had demonstrated that people with radically different worldviews could engage honestly with each other's ideas, could acknowledge the strength of opposing arguments without abandoning their own convictions. The Georgetown street was quiet and cool as they emerged from Edison's tavern, the weight of history settling around them like morning mist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new opportunities for either revolution or reform. But tonight, for just a few hours, two of history's most influential thinkers had found common ground in their shared commitment to reducing human suffering and expanding human freedom. They parted ways at the corner, each walking off into the darkness with his worldview intact but somehow enlarged by the encounter. Behind them, the bartender locked up the tavern, unaware that he had just witnessed a debate that would echo through the centuries, shaping the dreams and nightmares of generations yet unborn. The questions Marx and Burke had wrestled with that night, about violence and justice, about change and stability, about who should have the power to shape society's future, remained as urgent and unanswered as ever. But their example suggested that perhaps the questions themselves were more important than any final answers, that the ongoing struggle to balance competing values and interests was itself the highest form of human political achievement. In the end, both revolution and reform would have their day, would succeed and fail in ways neither man could have predicted. But the conversation they had shared, civil, passionate, honest, and inconclusive, would remain as a model for how human beings might approach their deepest disagreements without destroying each other in the process.